Hi all, Wonton here, and welcome to my first guide for battle for Azeroth, the Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue is a really fun and versatile rogue spec. Depending on the setup, it can have some of the best single target DPS in the game, or it can be a really solid AoE spec for dungeons. On top of that, it's probably the best rogue spec for sort of general outdoor content, soloing, questing, and killing people in war mode if that's what you're interested in. So without further ado, let's get into the guide. I'll present a quick talent build here to get you started. This is not the only possible talent build, but it's the easiest one to learn the spec with, and it also happens to be the best on single target, and is very smooth and comfortable to play. The setup looks like this: Find Weakness, Shadow Focus, Marked for Death, Enveloping Shadows, and Master of Shadows. I'll talk more about the other talents later, but right now let's get into your basic abilities and rotation. The basics of Sub-Rogue continue to be mostly the same as they were in Legion. You have 5 combo points and 100 energy, mine's 105 because I'm a gnome, and you alternate between periods of high damaged fast-paced gameplay within Shadow Dance and periods of waiting and lower DPS when you're outside Shadow Dance. Your most basic generator is Backstab, which generates 1 combo point for 35 energy, and deals extra damage from behind. However, with the talent setup I gave you, you won't actually be using Backstab that much, as your Shadow Dance uptime will be so high that your main generator will actually be Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike can only be cast when you're in Stealth or Shadow Dance, but it deals way more damage than Backstab, and also gives you 2 combo points for 40 energy, making it way more efficient. Therefore, you never want to be using Backstab when you're in Stealth or Shadow Dance. As a bonus, when you're in Stealth, not Shadow Dance but real Stealth, Shadow Strike will deal bonus damage and also teleport you to the target. Your final generator is Shuriken Storm, which sprays shurikens at everything around you and generates 1 combo point per target hit. Obviously, this should be used on AoE. Outside Shadow Dance, it replaces Backstab on 2+ targets, and within Shadow Dance, it replaces Shadow Strike on 3+ targets. Shuriken Storm also grants you Shuriken Combo, which buffs your next Eviscerate depending on how many targets you hit. As a quick note, you also have the Shadow Techniques passive, which will make auto attacks generate a combo point at 8 energy sometimes. If you see combo points appearing out of nowhere, that's not a bug. Okay, now that you have 4 to 5 combo points, you need to spend them. Your first spender is Nightblade, which applies a dot to the target and, more importantly, amplifies all damage you deal to the target while it's affected by Nightblade. This needs to be maintained on your primary target at all times, as even though the dot itself isn't huge, a 15% damage increase against the target is huge. Like all dots, if you refresh Nightblade early, you can get up to 30% increased duration on it, a mechanic commonly called Pandemic. This means that with 4 combo points, Nightblade can be refreshed with less than 4.2 seconds remaining, and with 5 combo points with less than 4.8. Finally, once Nightblade's up on your target, all your remaining combo points will go into Eviscerate. This finisher is pretty straightforward. It simply deals heavy physical damage per combo point, but it's also the biggest source of damage you have since you'll be using it so much. Another quick note here, don't forget about the Relentless Strikes passive, which gives you 6 energy per combo point when you use a finisher. With 5 combo points, this means Eviscerate almost refunds its cost, and Nightblade is actually an energy gain, so keep that in mind and don't wait too long to use your finishers. As a general rule, subs should use a finisher almost immediately after hitting 4 to 5 combo points. Otherwise, not only could you waste combo points from Shadow Techniques, you could waste energy from Relentless Strikes. Anyway, that's it. Those 5 abilities are your basic rotation, but let's get into the more complicated stuff and talk about cooldowns and Shadow Dance usage. Let's start with the regular cooldowns, because this part's actually not that complicated. You have Symbols of Death, which has a short cooldown, generates 40 energy, and gives you a 15% damage buff for 10 seconds. You should use this on cooldown as long as you're at about 50 energy or less. You don't want to waste the energy gain. However, an important part of proper Symbols usage is refreshing Nightblade before it. If Nightblade expires during Symbols, you've made a mistake. So make sure it's refreshed with enough duration before going into Symbols, even if you need to break the normal rules for dot refresh thresholds. Shadow Blades is your long cooldown, and it does 2 things. It makes all your generators generate an extra combo point, and it makes them deal an extra 50% damage as Shadow. This cooldown's not that spectacular. A lot of these extra combo points end up wasted, but just use it on cooldown and enjoy what you do get. Marked for Death is one we got from talents, and it ranges from kinda boring to really strong. On single target, you just use it on cooldown when you're at 0 combo points. Since it has a 30-second cooldown, you can line it up with symbols every time, which is nice. In dungeons or in fights with adds, you can use it to snipe low health targets, since its cooldown resets when the target dies. If your fingers are fast, you can get many resets of this, and get tons of free eviscerates. Finally, Vanish is technically a DPS cooldown, since it also allows you to use one Shadow Strike. Since Vanish grants you actual stealth, this Shadow Strike will also gain the teleport, and the 25% damage buff. The gain from using Vanish is pretty small to be honest, so if you think you'll need Vanish as a utility cooldown in a dungeon, just hold it. One extra Shadow Strike every 2 minutes isn't that big a deal. Though obviously people min-maxing for raid will use Vanish in their rotation. Okay, let's get into the meat of things and talk about Shadow Dance some more. Although it has a 1 minute cooldown and only lasts 5 seconds, with Deepening Shadows and Enveloping Shadows, its cooldown is reduced by 2.5 seconds per combo point spent, or 12.5 seconds for a 5 combo point finisher, or 25 seconds from just 2 finishers. And of course, because it allows the use of Shadow Strike, Shadow Dance allows you to generate, and therefore spend, way more combo points, accelerating its own cooldown. And this is made even easier because of the energy sustain you get from Shadow Focus and Master of Shadows. Are you tired of the word shadow yet, by the way? So, overall, although the spell has a 5-second duration and a 1 minute cooldown, your actual uptime on it is much higher than that. In fact, you'll cycle through so many Shadow Dances that you should end up using more Shadow Strikes than Backstabs overall. So despite what I said earlier about Backstab being the default generator, with this build, it's really Shadow Strike that's the default generator. So, how do you properly use Shadow Dance? Well, you're going to want to start at 0 to 1 combo points, then go Shadow Strike, Finisher, Shadow Strike, Shadow Strike. Since we don't get any actual damage bonuses from Shadow Dance, that finisher can be Nightblade or Eviscerate. If you have 3 targets, you can use Shuriken Storm instead of Shadow Strike. And if you have at least 4 targets, you can instead go Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate, Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate, Shuriken Storm. Again, Eviscerate gets no bonus from being cast during Shadow Dance, but Shuriken Storm does, so we prioritize fitting more Shuriken Storms into the dance window. This is a good rule of thumb for the build as a whole. Don't think of Shadow Dance as a time to deal lots of damage, think of Shadow Dance as a time to generate lots of combo points efficiently. However, that philosophy gets flipped on its head when we look at this other sub-rogue build. The alternative build is to take the Dark Shadow and Secret Technique talents. This changes our playstyle quite a bit actually. Without Enveloping Shadows, our dance uptime goes down. And without Master of Shadows, you actually need to pool energy before going into a dance, or you'll be energy starved. However, the trade-off is significantly more damage during Shadow Dance, and a cool new finisher that actually deals AoE damage. Overall, this build's playstyle is a lot more clunky, with more waiting, more pooling, more backstab casts, and that actually deals about 6% less single target damage. However, what you gain is noticeably increased AoE. Not anywhere near a Demon Hunter or like a Windwalker or a Ret, but decent. Much better than with Enveloping Shadows, which for all intents and purposes is purely a single target build. Playing this build is more tricky, which is why I didn't mention that at the start. I don't recommend switching to it until you've learned the other build and are comfortable with this spec. With Dark Shadow, Shadow Dance is a direct damage increase now, so you have to play it much more precisely. Nightblade can't be refreshed during Shadow Dance ever, as doing so costs you a 25% buff to Eviscerate. You also want to hold on to a Shadow Dance charge, so you can pair it with Symbols of Death every time. Also, Secret Technique should be used during Shadow Dance whenever possible. The name of the game here is stacking cooldowns to turn Shadow Dance into a big burst window. On single target, Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, Shadow Strike is still okay, but something like Eviscerate, Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, Shadow Strike gets more damage into that window. Actually, the dream, I think, is to go into Dance at 5 combo points with Nightblade and Symbols running, and then hit Secret Technique, Marked for Death Eviscerate, Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, resulting in crazy burst damage from getting 3 finishers into your Shadow Dance window. On AoE, this new build really begins to shine, as the increased combo point generation of Shuriken Storm lets you get some of the feel of that first build back, with faster Shadow Dance cycling. Ideally, on a pole with 4 to 5 targets, a common dungeon scenario, you'll want to fit Secret Technique and 2 Eviscerates into a Shadow Dance. Remember to do this on a primary target that has Nightblade applied, and ideally also find weakness. Like all flavors of Sub-Rogue, your AoE won't truly be AoE, as most of the damage is really just Eviscerates buffed by Shuriken combo, but that's just the nature of the spec. You're much better at killing a single priority target than dealing even AoE damage to a whole pack. Okay, we've discussed pretty much everything DPS related, so let's put it all together, and then look at an opener. Overall, to generate combo points, use Backstab or Shadow Strike in Shadow Dance. Switch to Shuriken Storm on 2+ targets or on 3+ in Shadow Dance. Then at 4 or 5 combo points, use a finisher. Maintain Nightblade on a primary target, spend the rest on Secret Technique and Eviscerate. Use Symbols of Death, Shadow Blades, Marked for Death and Vanish on cooldown. With Enveloping Shadows, use Shadow Dance for Shadow Strike, Finisher, Shadow Strike, Shadow Strike. With Dark Shadow, line up Shadow Dance with symbols and try to fit in 2 to 3 finishers. That brings us to the opener, which looks like this on single target, assuming you're using Enveloping Shadows. Shadow Blades, Shadow Strike, Nightblade. Pop Dance and Symbols of Death, then Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, Shadow Strike, Eviscerate. Shadow Dance again, Shadow Strike, Eviscerate, Shadow Strike, Nightblade. As for an AoE opener, assuming you're playing the Dark Shadow build, Shadow Strike, Nightblade, Shuriken Storm, hit Dance and Symbols of Death, and then Secret Technique, Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate, Shuriken Storm, Eviscerate. At this point your dance will run out, and you can either build 5 combo points and go into another dance, or save it for a future burst window. Alright, now I know everyone's going to be clamoring for advice on Azerite traits, but the reality is that the best advice I can give you here is to check 2 websites, HeroDamage.com and RaidBots.com. Hero Damage will show you sims of which traits appear the best, and RaidBots will let you easily compare any 2 pieces of gear, including Azerite gear with traits. In general, what I can tell you is that Inevitability and Blade in the Shadows are considered really strong traits. Like most specs, we also have a lot of good neutral traits like Thunderous Blast, Dagger in the Back, Champion of Azeroth, and so on. When in doubt, a 15 item level upgrade is usually worth it unless the trait is just truly awful. Ultimately, the advice I can give you here is very limited, as Azerite traits are very likely to get nerfed and buffed. Check Hero Damage, check Raidbots, and you can find the answer for yourself within a few minutes. For stats and gearing, I have basically the same advice, but here are my stat weights for both Enveloping Shadows and Dark Shadow. In general, agility is at the top, then crit and haste, but realistically there's not much difference between the 4 secondaries, so item level pretty much always wins out. I will note, however, that on AoE, the value of Mastery goes up, so don't think it's bad just because it's in 3rd place. And although Verse is last, it also has defensive benefits, so yeah, all 4 stats are basically the same. It's really close. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers everything with regards to Sub-Rogue DPS. If you like my UI, my weak auras are available in the description. And if you like this guide or you want to see other guides from me, leave a comment and subscribe. I'd appreciate it very much. Thanks for watching.